So all throughout this chapter in the 1970s, we've been taking a look at how the changes in American society impact our economy, impact our politics, our foreign policy. And today what we're going to take a look at is how these changes are going to impact several different groups of Americans, just so that we can see and kind of expand our study of the groups of Americans that are pushing for their own rights and for their own changes. And one of those changes in the 1970s has to do with the fact that there's still racial tension left over from the 1960s. Remember, it's not long ago that we were talking about 1968 as this kind of year when we have all of these many different racial riots going on around the cities. And really, it's not even until 1969, if you remember, when we talked about York having its own race riots. So it's still a time of serious kind of anger and frustration and debate and tension between the races. Martin Luther King wasn't assassinated until 1968. So really what we're looking at here, what we have to try and remember is that there's still changes that have to be made because racial tension will still remain. Now, we know from what we've studied in the past that with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, schools were not permitted to be segregated. And we know that the Supreme Court has also said that those schools had to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. And we know that that was vague, fuzzy wording so that there would be schools that wouldn't really have to do anything at all to desegregate for 10 years. But the problem continues to persist, not because schools necessarily are designing school districts that in fact are segregated, but because of de facto segregation. Now take a look. I'm getting my head and my elephant out of the way here. Here's a little map of New York City that you're looking at. And on this map of New York City, this is from 2010. And what you can see here, just by looking at this, is that most immigrants still, even in 2010, and most ethnic minorities still in 2010, live in self-segregated or de facto segregated communities. And we've talked about this again and again and again, that these communities, while they might be all one thing or all the other, whether it's Mexican immigrants, whether it's Korean immigrants in Queens, whether it's Caribbean immigrants in Jamaica, whatever, or in South Jamaica over here, it doesn't matter. Chinese immigrants in Little Chinatown, or Chinatown rather, in Little Italy, of course, for Italian immigrants. The point I'm making is that America is still, urban-wise, in its cities, and really even in its suburbs, still very much segregated for a variety of reasons. Remember, we talked about poverty keeping people in cities. We talked about limited job opportunities in cities. These are all things that can keep people segregated. So the Supreme Court decides to use a policy to break this segregation called busing. And the concept here is that you should be able to transport kids from one district where they live to another district outside of where they live in order to have greater racial balance. And the idea is that, let's say you live in York, a big city like Boston, right? It's one school system, Boston City Public Schools, but depending on the neighborhood and the taxes in each school, you might see a different kind of quality education or not. But the argument would be that it's one school system, so it doesn't matter where you go to school as long as you end up going to a school where you're getting the same reasonable education. So we should be able to bus kids, white kids into black neighborhoods, black kids into white neighborhoods to have racial balance. And this creates protests on all different sides. Whites, north and south, protests and riot like crazy. And you can see here all these different people protesting against busing. You see those people there? Ella, do you see them?
I see them.
And here we are seeing people who want to be bused into different school districts. Ella, do you see them?
Yes, I see them too.
Okay, Ella, what can you tell me? What do you notice about these groups of people, the people who want busing and access to different school districts, and the people who don't on the bottom?
Well, it looks to me like, people on the bottom who don't want to move are all white. And everyone who wants to move is all black.
You don't say, Ella.
I know.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you're right. What you end up seeing here, Ella, quite clearly, is that African Americans in their neighborhoods, which we know are impoverished during the 1970s, 60s, and 50s, are looking for ways out of those neighborhoods, and an education would be that way. And whites, looking to maintain their privilege and their power, do not want to move. They do not want an inferior education or an education in a different school. And this works its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And what we see in a Supreme Court case called Milken versus Bradley, it says that you can only bus kids across district lines if a district was designed to actually segregate. Otherwise, you can't do it. And when this does happen, lots of white parents take their kids out of schools and they begin something known as white flight. And we'll do some more with that in class tomorrow, that concept of white flight. So don't worry about that right now.